Good afternoon. So for the first session of our keynote lunch, have a seat, Joe. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce and to interview Joe Lonsdale. Joe, as you probably are aware, is the founder of AT&T, which is a leading venture capital firm in Silicon Valley. Joe is viewed by many as sort of the leader of the new group of venture capitalists doing important things. He's previously was the co-founder of Palantir, OpenGov, Adapar, and a number of very significant disruptive businesses. And he's somebody that we just admire quite a bit. So it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk with him today.
Thanks, Michael, for having me today.
So Joe, your motto at AVC is "The world's broken, let's fix it." How does that, when you think about education, how does that apply?
Sure. Well, I think it definitely applies to education, as I think probably most people here are quite aware, given there's so many people working on amazing ways of fixing our education system and making it work better. I think there's a lot of platitudes everyone's already heard about how it's designed for a different economy 100, 200 years ago. I think the bigger question is, why is it so broken and why is it so hard to fix? And I do think we're making a lot of great progress, but I think one of the big problems is that we've taken away any sort of system of market or incentives that you would normally get in other industries. And so when you come up with really good ideas, and other startup companies we've built, you're able to kind of compete in a market, and if it works, it grows bigger, rather than having to go and try to convince state legislatures that your startup is good. I probably wouldn't be here as a known entrepreneur if my job had been to have to go convince all these government officials. And so I think the really key thing for fixing education is the policy has to align incentives and markets and financial incentives with success. And so my favorite way of doing that right now that I think would actually help us fix it is in at the college level. I think the loan system is really broken. I think instead of giving loans per student, which allows all these schools to be diploma mills, I think the schools should get paid by their students' success long term, and there's ways of aligning incentives that way, which would let us innovate.
That's worth a clap. Good.
Thanks.
So which is the one area that no one's focusing on today, but 3 years from now is going to be really important to society?
You mean generally in Silicon
Valley? Yeah, generally.
That's an interesting question. So I guess to skip away from education for a bit, I do think this is a really important area to fix with the incentives thing that people probably aren't focused on enough. But outside of that, in Silicon Valley, the big question we always ask is what's possible now that was not possible 5 years ago, right? So for example, before the smartphone existed, if you tried to start a company like Uber or even Airbnb, I think it'd be really difficult to get to scale. But after the smartphone existed, those are great companies. And if you try to start those nowadays, you'd be 10 years late. And so the thing is, what's new right now that's happening? And in my mind, the biggest new thing that's going to create the most value that is still not getting nearly enough attention is the overlap between biotech and IT. There's been a lot of breakthroughs in the last 3 or 4 years that allow us to do things with reading and writing DNA and synthetic biology, and how we understand the microbiome, and how we train T cells to hunt cancer, and all these things that kind of take computer scientists with biotech. So for me, that's the probably most exciting new area in Silicon Valley.
Great. So talk about the trend you call the smart enterprises wave, and what implications does that have to the future of work and jobs?
Sure. So the smart enterprise wave is a theme that we talk a lot about at our fund and with some of our friends. The basic idea is that in Silicon Valley, we've had these different waves based on new things that are possible. And of course, if you go back about 30 or 40 years, you had a lot of the first software built that runs most of the big industries in the US, right? So if you go into a lot of education systems still, if you go into a lot of hospitals, government organizations, logistics companies, they're all running off of software built in the 70s or 80s. And what the smart enterprise wave is it's a new wave of companies that really started, in Palantir and Adapar, I guess, and things I've been involved in are probably included in this wave, where they're for the first time coming in and replacing a lot of these systems from 3 or 4 decades ago. And that's happening at a really fast pace. And the reason that's happening now, after not having happened for a few decades, is a lot of these industries, for the first time, are capturing all this data, and they need to integrate that data, and they need to ask questions of it, and they need to do basically nonlinear things with that data. So and these old systems are very good at doing the very simple linear workflows they were created to do, but you're not able to do nonlinear workflows with these systems. And so as these new platforms get in place and kind of aggregate the data for these different industries, you basically end up fixing these industries, making them innovate a lot faster. And I guess you're saying, what does it mean for work? Basically, a lot of stuff that can be automated with data will be automated. And so it means in order to do work, you have to be more creative, entrepreneurial. You have to be doing more thinking work and less kind of routine automatable work.
And I want to get in this deeper in a few minutes, but you've written a couple great essays that I encourage anybody to go Google search on kind of the Keynes point that I mentioned last night about how, 1930, he talked about technological unemployment. And so you think about the automation, and as it relates to innovation, some people say it's kind of the end of man or whatever, but you talk about how this really should be a driver of new great jobs and innovation. So we'll talk a little bit about that.
Sure, no, yeah, we're guilty of being an optimist here, which I think it's very popular in Silicon Valley right now to forecast the end of all jobs and a disaster, which is quite ironic if you look at the fact that we have tighter labor markets in the last year or two than we've had in a very long time. And I think jobs work from the bottom up, not the top down. It's very, very hard to kind of map out as if you're like a socialist country, like what the jobs are going to be and how they're going to work. But I think these things do tend to work. And the point is, like, yeah, Keynes was very interested 100 years ago in technological unemployment. And I think it's worth going back and reading that essay in light of current affairs and how much he was sure that there'd basically be nothing at all for people to do as these trends of automation continued. And my generally optimistic view is that there's just so many new ways that we've continued to create jobs over the last 100 years. And unless AI gets to the point where it's actually smarter than each of us, and if it gets to that point, by the way, we have a whole other set of problems about the existential nature of our lives. But until it gets to that point, I think there's just a lot of areas that I'm very bullish on. Yeah,
and again, Joe wrote two terrific essays. But one I thought was interesting is how right he was on certain things, from a macroeconomic standpoint, and how wrong he was basically on the...
Keynes predicted our level of income pretty accurately 100 years ago. He definitely got a lot of that right, but he assumed that the nature of people was to only work to make a living, as opposed to work for reasons of frankly of fixing the world and of expressing ourselves and things like that. So he assumed that once everyone got to like a middle class 1930s level, you'd have no interest in doing work anymore if you didn't have to. You'd only work a few hours a week, but obviously that's not what society wants.
Right. So talk about your perspective on human-machine symbiosis, and how does this relationship affect education?
Sure. So the topic of, we call it, I guess, it originally was called man-machine symbiosis in the 1960s. I guess you're not allowed to use that term anymore. So now it's human-machine symbiosis. That's funny. I mean, the basic idea is there's certain things people are better at, and there's certain things machines are better at. So like when you talk about the smart enterprise wave, and you're going in and you're kind of automating and putting a layer of data and computation in all these industries, not necessarily replacing people, you're augmenting them. And so the question is, like, what skills do people need in that world? And I guess this is especially relevant for education, because a lot of the way education was taught historically, which was a lot more rote and was a lot more structured, that might work well in a world where people need to do a lot of these kind of more structured and rote tasks. But as computers can handle more and more of that for us, and we're pushed much more into the creative and analytical side of work, that means education really should be reflecting that, and it needs to be reflecting that if people are going to have relevant skills in the economy in the next couple of decades.
That's great. And again, one of the things I loved about the paper, a number of people talk about, and you talk about your optimism about people find ways to create and innovate, so this idea that jobs are going away, there's no ever going to be any new work, is some people predict, but a lot of people tell you, well, no, people create and so forth. One of the things I love about your essay is you go to the next step and you actually talk about 12 distinct jobs of the future. So talk about some of those jobs and why you think those will be kind of the future of work.
That's kind of fun. It's always a little bit ridiculous to try to predict, 30, 40, 50 years ahead what jobs would look like. I guess the analogy is if you try to tell someone in the 1880s or early 1900s what MTV and air traffic controllers and things were like, it's at that point they're like, what are you talking about? So with that kind of ridiculousness in mind, there's a lot of areas I think are really interesting. Like some of the more creative ones I think it's going to be possible to quantify how your mind works in a lot of different ways and how it's responding. And so I think there's going to be a lot more coaching in terms of understanding. You can watch yourself at work that day, and you could see, well, here's where I got really insecure, or here's where I got angry, or here's where I reacted really badly and had all this ego that made me miss this. And so as you quantify that, maybe there's jobs or people working with you in a much kind of deeper psychological coach type of way. That'd be one kind of fun example. Another silly example is there's probably all sorts of new animals we can design and create that will play different roles in our society, and how the whole industry around designing them and working with them and caring for them. There's going to be a lot of people employed there. And then there's more obvious things. I mean, one of the more obvious things is baby boomers are getting older, and they're probably going to need and want a lot of special attention. And there's probably millions of potential jobs around how senior care adapts and how the human touch is important in senior care. And if you kind of draw that out, there's just a huge amount to do there, and there's a huge lack of people available, even in the U.S. Right now, who could take those jobs. And so those are just a few examples. There's an article we wrote in Wired that had a bunch of them. So I think it is kind of fun to think about and be optimistic about.
So how many people in the room have heard of Palantir? So, and I can't really see the percentage, but so Palantir is probably the biggest and most important company that some of you never heard about. And in fact, so its market value is somewhere between 10 and $20 billion. But more significantly, anybody who's...
You would know the secondary market, huh?
But we might have a little bit of a perspective. But actually, more importantly, if you've ever been to Palo Alto and you walk around downtown Palo Alto, you see that about 25 buildings have the name Palantir on it. So what I say is pretty soon Palo Alto is going to change its name to Palantir. But anyway, and Joe is the co-founder of that. So talk about big data. And when you started Palantir in 2004?
Yeah, we started working on it a little bit in 2003 and launched it in 2004. That's right. And by the way, I'm a victim of the Palo Alto real estate thing too. It's kind of annoying. So yeah. I apologize for that.
So talk about what you saw for the opportunity of big data then versus how you see big data and Palantir solving issues today and how it's progressed. And then maybe a little bit about how you think big data can be applied in the education and talent world.
Sure. Well, when we were starting Palantir, it was much more about like productizing these large areas of IT services. That was the initial view of where we were coming from. And so I don't want to talk too much about it, but the high level idea was that there's like $100 billion a year spent on kind of building these platforms within areas like government and finance and others. Government and finance are the two biggest. And rather than spend so much money every time on these new service platforms, can we design a product out of the box that does the vast majority of that? And so, instead of doing a $3 billion contract for DHS with someone like a Unisys or whatever, can we do that out of the box in a couple of months based on a platform we've designed? And so, but back then you didn't really have much talk of any big data or anything like that, but it was clear that the platforms that allow people to collaborate with data and connect and kind of empower humans to navigate huge amounts of data and make decisions was pretty broken. And it's pretty clear stuff like 9/11 should not have happened if data was being brought together and used effectively. And you had to kind of create these processes through technology that made it easier to collaborate and to access all of this. And so obviously it was a very mission-driven company inspired to go in, fix how the intelligence community shared data, make sure it was done in a better way, but also a way that worked with civil liberties. And then obviously finance, healthcare, energy, all these other industries have that problem too. I think Palantir was very lucky to kind of catch this wave, a few years ahead of time. Like most of these companies were started 2010, 2012 in terms of the big data stuff. And because we were already there doing that, as all these industries realized this was a problem, I think Palantir was able to grow very quickly at that point. The thing I'd say that people still don't realize there's all this stuff about AI right now and how AI is gonna change everything. And it is true that AI is being used very well, especially by like Amazon and Google and some of these more sophisticated companies. But a lot of these big industries, the problem is not how you analyze things. It's the fact that the data is still not all together. It's actually very, very expensive and very hard to build the processes that capture the data and bring it all to one place and let you work on it. So the effort usually is like you need like several hundred people to get the data together in order to have it there. And then you can hire like a couple AI grad students and a few friends, and we can map out this like genius thing. And everyone wants to talk about what those genius grad students are doing on our platform, but it's really like the platform underneath it and getting it all there that's most of the work and most of the value.
So talk about how you could see big data impact the education world?
Definitely, and I think there's probably a lot of people in the audience who know this better than me, but I mean, I'm involved in a few companies doing that. And it's a similar thing. The question is, how do you collect relevant data that you can then use in ways that are not, that you can calculate in nonlinear ways, you can personalize things for people. So I guess there's two sides of it that are pretty obvious. On one side, I think it's very important to just to get better at like knowing exactly where students are in terms of large ontologies of learning, and to learn over time through the same way we do online A/B testing for like getting people to want to buy a product. You could do A/B testing for what works for students with this background, this skill set. They need to learn this. What's the best way to get them to learn this quickly? What's the best way to make sure we're not leaving them behind? So I mean, there's a lot of great people working on that here. I think we're going to learn faster what kind of personalization with data works. We're going to learn faster how to capture that data better in order to feed into those algorithms. So I think that's one side. I think the other side is the big institutions and them using data to learn to predict. So I guess going back to the thing I said initially, I think this is an important topic, is how do you align incentives for large institutions? So I think the best way, for example, vocational schools should work is there should be financial intermediaries loaning money to them, and the schools are getting paid back by their students' career success. And so basically big data allows you to measure the skills the students are learning, allows you to measure their early career success, allows you to understand which of these schools should get more resources and less resources financially because they're going to be able to train students better. And so I think both on the financial incentive side of education and on the personalized learning side, it's really important.
So talk about the Hyperloop, because you're involved in a number of big ideas, but this is a very big idea. So first talk about how it all came about, and then talk about what it is and where you think it can go.
All right. We'll talk about the Hyperloop. I am lucky to have led the Series A in the biggest Hyperloop company, which, as many of you know, Hyperloop is an idea that has been around for a while in different forms, but was named and popularized by Elon Musk. And the basic idea is that you could take these high-speed trains in Japan that go about 300 miles per hour, and you could wrap a steel cylinder around them, take out the air, and do a few other complicated engineering things that are above my pay grade as a computer scientist. And you can get them to go 700, 750 miles per hour, and they take up a lot less energy to run. So it's a very important advance in transportation. It's pretty clear to a lot of people this is possible. We're planning on having a working prototype that we've spent over $100 million on in the Nevada desert, pretty nearby here, I guess, relative to California. We're going to have that working prototype hopefully this summer, it looks like. And I guess the reason I'm most passionate about the Hyperloop, first of all, it'd be really cool to be able to get to Utah or Vegas a lot more quickly and not have to wait at the airport. So that's a neat one. But the really most important thing is what this does for cities around America. One of the big challenges that a lot of us discuss is how if you're not really well off, it's really hard to be part of the Silicon Valley economy right now, because there's all these NIMBY groups that have stopped us from building more in the Bay Area. It's a huge issue, and you can't blame people. They buy a house, they want the value to go up. They basically stop you from building in the area. And so we've gotten to the point now where Silicon Valley is more expensive than anywhere else in the country, and it makes it really hard for me to build companies there. Frankly, my friends to build companies there, and it's really unfair to up and coming people who want to be part of the ecosystem that it's just so expensive to live there. So the question is, how do you fix this? And one way you fix this is you fight NIMBYism. You try to go to one of these cities and get them to build something, which a lot of us are trying to do, and that'd be good for the economy. It'd be good for income mobility, basically, people to be able to come and join. But the other really neat kind of cheat code we could do is the Hyperloop. And the reason that's a cheat code is if you can build a tunnel underground and you have a bunch of stops around the Bay Area, and you could have inexpensive middle-class housing 200 miles outside the city, and you can commute in 10 or 15 minutes, that completely changes the nature of this problem, right? So this could actually be a really big deal for income inequality in America if we can deploy Hyperloop type infrastructure for making it possible to live in these areas. And so that's something I'm very excited about.
Yeah, you mentioned Elon Musk, and you've worked and founded businesses with Elon Musk and Peter Thiel. What have you learned, or lessons from two people that obviously are big thinkers and doing incredible things? What are some of the takeaways?
Sure, I've worked a lot more closely with Peter than Elon, although I definitely admire both of them. We have something online I wrote to everyone at Palantir about things I learned from Peter. I guess, he's probably one of the best conceptual minds I've worked with. There's just a lot of really good intellectual discipline, I'd say. We've written about it more online. One of the things is that your output is convex. And this is ironic given that we're talking about all these different things, but at any given time, like my rule is I'm only responsible for the failure of one thing, and that really came from kind of having worked with him and his network. And basically, the more time you spend on any one thing, it's exponential what you can get done. So you don't want to divide your efforts. I think is a really key lesson as an entrepreneur. Another thing that Peter really focused on, I know Elon does too, is how valuable top talent is. Like those top 1% of people who are really, really smart, really eager to work really hard, mission driven. Like spending your time getting the top talent around you is probably the most important thing you could do. And when you talk about that, the returns to intelligence and drive are probably higher than almost anything else. And so I think both Peter and Elon value experience, but you actually even more value drive and intelligence in a core team because you can always learn and iterate. So I thought that was good. And I mean, I guess another thing with Peter I'd say is there's always lots of stuff going on, and a lot of people like to talk about the fact that they're going to do something or they're going to talk about it, and he never talks about what he's going to do. He just does it now. He just like jumps right into the strategy, right into the getting it done, and very efficient with his time. So, but both those guys and what they built at PayPal, where I was lucky to be an intern, and what Peter and I built together is great to learn from them.
So you were a initial investor in Oculus, which was bought by Facebook. What do you see as the potential for VR in the education world and future work?
Definitely, yeah. Well, Oculus was an amazing team. We're very lucky to be involved there. One of the early pieces of excitement was what's possible in education there. I don't know exactly how far off we are. I know there's a lot of people working on really great VR education right now, and I'd love it to be the case that it's so useful that it's going to be in every classroom in the next decade. I think that may be the case. I always loved history, so I thought that would be a really fun way to teach history and that kind of interaction. But in general, I think what you're going to see is it's going to go back to that personalized learning thing, where I think people learn a lot better when they're inspired and when they're engaged based on stuff they really care about. So the question is to develop different types of content that's inspiring for kids in the right way and that engages them with the topics in the right way. One of the, I guess the example I'd give is one of our friends is the world chess champion, Magnus Carlsen, and I always would ask him how he'd studied because I was curious. I was a chess player myself, and he'd get all this homework each day, but each day he'd only do half of his homework. He'd only do the half that he was most passionate about and most interested in, and that was a better way to learn. And I think that's true for a lot of things. You only want to engage, and educate and learn about things you're passionate about. So if we can use that to better engage kids, to get them more into environments, to make things more real, I think that's really powerful.
One of the mega trends that you're focused on is mass urbanization. And we talked about the Hyperloop as it related to kind of future work, but what other kind of implications does that have for the future work? What kind of trends do you see, and what kind of problems are we fixing?
So just break. I think if anything, it's one of those things where it's probably gonna. I think it's funny you asked about right after VR because I think we're probably having this massive urbanization trend right now because the returns to working together in these high growth economic areas are so high. But I guess my hope would be that at some point within the next decade or two, the VR and the AR and the video screen technology is just so flawless and so good that we could be having this speech and no one would know that I'm actually sitting at home, or whatever, and didn't have to fly or whatnot. Which we'd be interacting just as well, doing that otherwise. And so I think it's like a very binary thing where you have the network effect of these like top cities. It just keeps growing exponentially and everyone has to be part of it. But I think it just breaks right away at some point very dramatically when the technology gets good enough to not allow that. So I think it may be the case that pretty soon we are able to actually work in a distributed fashion and it won't matter as much. So we'll see.
And you think and care a lot about government and government's role in different areas. What role do you think the state and federal government, biggest role they can play as it relates to education and maybe back to the original mission of fixing what's broken in the world?
Sure. Well, I mean, and this gets to be pretty controversial because we all have very different views on how governments work. I mean, I think going back to what we talked about before, I think it's really important to make room for innovators to get into the education world. And the question is, in what ways can innovation be allowed into education? In what ways can it be allowed to spread with market-like structures? And obviously, markets are very powerful, very useful things. But you got to be careful because markets can also leave people behind. And so the question is, how do we use markets without leaving the bottom behind there? And I think that's one of the government's biggest jobs to create the biggest thing I would say is we need to remember that the founders of America set it up so that we'd have laboratories of democracy. We'd have areas where we could try new things rather than imposing something on everyone. So making sure the states are able to try new things, making sure we're able to create areas where we can explore new incentives and see how they work and see how that grows and work with innovators to do that, I think is probably the biggest role they can have, is to make sure we are allowing innovation, make sure we are allowing people to try things out.
So what do you see as after the smart enterprises wave? What's next?
There's a lot of different debates around this. Some people think augmented reality is going to be so powerful and it's just going to change everything about how we interact, and it's going to, rather than have the phone in your pocket, there's going to be, maybe it's a little camera like the Google Glass guys are trying to do. It's probably going to be the case they were like 10 or 15 years early. I think there's a lot of new things there. I personally am most excited about all the bio-IT stuff I talked about earlier. I think that's where the most kind of impact's going to be had in the next decade in terms of just fundamentally changing how we understand our health and how human lifespan works, and how we're able to kind of keep our minds and our bodies, in a way that I think it's very inspiring what we're going to be able to do over the next 10, 20 years there. So for me, I'm hoping that's the biggest next area.
So I've got one last question for you. So you've got something like 400 education talent CEOs in the room. If you were to think about one bit of advice that you could give them, how they can create a successful business or something to really focus on, and you've given a lot of different input, what Peter's told you and what you've experienced yourself. But if there's one bit of advice you wanted to leave those entrepreneurs with, what would that be?
Gosh, that's a tough one. So I probably would have to do something more general to entrepreneurship, because I myself have not yet built a successful education company, so I wouldn't feel very good telling you how to do that. It seems a lot harder than building a successful healthcare or finance company in a lot of ways because of how the market's set up. I guess it's just a couple obvious things that I think are really important. Is find people who have been really successful in your particular field and get them on your side as best as you can. And when you're getting going with these things, the most important thing is not how much money you make for yourself with these companies. If you want to be successful long term, the question is how can you surround yourself with people who are going to be helpful to you long term, and how can you help them, and how can you get them allied in the right way. So I think that's always been very helpful for the things I've been lucky to work on.
Thank you very much. Give Joe a hand, please. Cool. Awesome. It was awesome. Good.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Andre Dua.
It would be nice if you could sort of pick your own song before you walk out, I think. I want to just start by introducing myself and then introduce the panelists. So thank you for being here at the lunch today. I'm Andre Dua from McKinsey, and we've got 4 really interesting panelists today to talk about the topic of the future of work is now. And first, our first panelist is Marco Zappacosta. He's the co-founder and CEO of Thumbtack, which some of you will know as a workplace for local services. A couple of things I think are really interesting. They have on this platform 250,000 local businesses, which provide services like home services and event services. And he's been working on this overnight success for 8 years. He's raised $250 million and has a team of 500 between Silicon Valley and Salt Lake City. So he's really, in some ways, a hometown boy now. The second person I'd like to introduce is Diane Adams. Diane is the CHRO of McGraw-Hill Education. She's the author of It Takes More Than Casual Fridays and Free Coffee, Building a Business Culture That Works. Her great passion is building great cultures, and she's done this at places like Click, Allscripts, and Cisco. Our third panelist today is John Palmer. John is the Chief Learning Officer of AT&T, and he manages $250 million in annual investment in learning and development. He hires 40,000 candidates internally and externally each year, and his real focus now at AT&T is reskilling the entire workforce. And last but not least, I want to introduce Rick Levin. Rick has been the CEO of Coursera since 2014. He was the president of Yale from 1993 to 2013. Prior to that, he had a real academic career as an economist. And he's probably been on more public service, corporate advisory, and nonprofit boards than I could mention if I started using the rest of the time. But so there are 4 illustrious panelists, and I'm very excited to welcome all 4 of them to the stage to join me for this session. So thank you, guys, for joining us here today for this panel, The Future of Work is Now. I thought what I might do is start with a few brief opening remarks and then start with some questions, none of which we've discussed before. We'll see how that goes. So look, just by way of context, I think a lot of the discussion we've been having at this conference so far has started to touch on the fact that work is already drastically changing in many ways. And I think we all know the forces of trade and technology have been changing. And just to give some examples, as many of you will know, manufacturing jobs in the US are down by about 7 million in the last 30-odd years. And on the other hand, there are new jobs for which there are great shortages. For example, there's about a gap of 1 million unfilled computer science positions in the country. But on top of that, I think one of the things we'll talk about today is the nature of automation, AI, machine learning, as Joe was discussing. And we at McKinsey have done some work which says with technology that's available just today, that 45% of activities that people are paid to perform could be automated. And so I think that puts into context the nature and scale of what the tsunami that might be coming. So I think some of the other things that I think we'll talk about today, and Marco, I'm sure you'll have a lot to say about this, is that the nature of work itself is changing, and a significant portion of Americans aren't really getting a regular paycheck. And often when we talk about the workforce, we tend to, and I fall into this trap, talking about the largest companies. But in reality, such a large portion of the workforce, a significant majority are either self-employed or employed by small and medium enterprises, and I think that's something we'd like to touch on today. And finally, just to connect it all to learning, I'd like to just share a quote from the CEO of Microsoft, Satya Nadella, who said, "Don't be a know-it-all, be a learn-it-all." And so I think in the context of the nature of work really changing, it'll be interesting to talk a little bit about what it is we all have to do to stay relevant. So perhaps with that we could start, and I guess before talking about the future of work itself, I'd invite a couple of you to share your thoughts on what the future of work might itself be. So Marco, would you like to share maybe a few scenarios about how you think the future of work might evolve?
Sure. So first off, thanks for having me. In this debate, or in this conversation, there's a lot of talk about automation and AI and sort of work that will go away. And a way of thinking about that is technology as a substitute for labor. But I don't think there is enough talk of how technology can be a complement to labor, as it has always been. And what we see happening, and sort of the McKinsey study certainly highlights this, is that there's some inexorable trends. So things that can be automated probably will be automated, just sort of a question of time. Things that can be traded away to lower cost places probably will be traded away. And so what that leaves are local, non-tradable, non-routine jobs, things that aren't easily automatable. Now, this broadly defines local services, things like healthcare, education, your plumber, your caterer. These are the types of jobs that we see employing huge fractions of countries, not just our own, but around the world in the future. And it's something that we, I think, want to make sure that there is a spotlight on. Because there's these great big organizations, the AT&Ts, the Ciscos, they employ huge numbers of people and do an amazing job at that. But there's even bigger numbers of people who are working for themselves or in very small enterprises. So one thing that sort of we like to bring a focus to is the nature of work on the smallest scales for these individuals. And for them, it's really about learning a trade that is valuable to their community that people are willing to pay for as a service to themselves or their business. And there's a lot that goes into that, from education and training, but those are jobs that won't go away, and so those are jobs that we have to make sure to support and empower.
Rick?
You know, if economic history teaches us anything, it's that we're not very good at predicting what the future will be in terms of the nature of work. So you go back to the first industrial revolution, when 80% of the people in England were in agriculture, and the relatively small number of people who were, hand loom operators or ran spinning wheel operations, they were clearly going to get unemployed by the first industrial revolution, and they did. But new factory jobs emerged. Industries grew much larger than anyone expected. And we built a whole middle class around industrial workers who actually had a much better livelihood than the agricultural and cottage industry people they displaced. So you just can't tell. Just go back, think about 1982, the advent of the personal computer. Everybody said, well, office work is doomed. Secretaries and assistants are going to be so much more productive that we'll need way fewer of them. Well, guess what? There's more office workers today than there were 30 years ago. So it's very hard to predict. I do think Marco's onto something conceptually when he says, there will be forms of services that will grow. That's surely the most likely candidate, but it's really hard to predict. And you may say, just because AI is capable of putting people out of work, the jobs as we define them now, doesn't mean that human imagination won't think of other things to productively do. So I'm not a pessimist about this. There have been 2.5 centuries of economic pessimists, and they've been wrong every time.
All right, so at least two of you would prefer not to be pessimistic in this session. So maybe using that as a jumping off point, there is a lot of talk about the skill gap. And I think often used generically without talking about where the gap is. And currently, there are about 6 million unfilled jobs in the country. And so, John, maybe if you could share some thoughts on where you see the skill gap, how serious a problem you think it is, and at least at AT&T, what do you observe about that, and how are you trying to address that issue?
I think there is absolutely a skills gap in the U.S., and it's centered around all of the STEM learnings and technologies that are out there, and we need to make sure that pipeline at a much earlier stage in education is much richer. We need to teach those skill sets much earlier on in education, and we also need to focus people, careers as they're thinking about what do they do for undergraduate, what do they think for graduate degrees. Then that STEM space is one that is an absolute necessity for businesses to be able to farm from, and that is only going to continue to grow, in our opinion, especially as technologies change. I think it's also interesting to note that there is skills gap in the existing workforce as well, and that's one of the reasons why we're taking on a fairly large reskilling effort of our own internal workforce, because there is not enough skill sets outside of AT&T to be able to hire the type of talent that we need for the jobs of the future at the scale that we're at. And we also don't want to lose the great culture that our employees have built within our corporation. So that's why we are reskilling our workforce. We have significant programs, significant external partnerships, one with Coursera as an example, where it allows employees to be able to opt into what job of the future they want. It's all about being transparent to employees about what skill sets we're going to need today, tomorrow, and 5 to 10 years from now, and then giving them the tools, resources, and education curriculums to be able to engage in and actually transform their skill sets.
Speaking of an audience we don't normally talk about, so you tend to talk about the group of people who are post-secondary educated, but if you really stop and think about it, 30% or less of Americans are post-secondary educated, which leaves a lot of people. And the jobs you just talked about, many of them require skills which do involve post-secondary education. So, and I want you to talk about a little bit about this,
right,
and how we solve this issue, because talking just about the people who go to college either now or when they're in their as working adults is a whole different thing, and it leaves ignored a big part of the problem, right?
And I think that you don't need to always look for that secondary degree that's out there in these spaces and many spaces out there. I think that the educational system needs to become more affordable, more flexible, and more accessible for everyone. And you can think about lots of different models. There are certification models that are out there in unique spaces where you don't have to go and commit that 2-3 years to get that degree, and you can actually just become a specialist in that space. And that's one of the things that we're exploring across our workforce, and one of the tools that we're opening up to our employees to say, you don't have to have that master's in computer science, but we really need you to be certified in this particular area, in data analytics, in cloud computing, pick whatever topic is out there. And as people become more in tune with being flexible with their learning, and as there are more tools and resources that are out there that people can engage with, then I think that you will start to unleash this concept of a culture of continuous learning. And employees and employers will start to better understand the fact that there is not one skill set or one thing that we want our employees to be trained on. We want our employees to be trained on this today, but then there's going to be something else tomorrow. And that's where we really need to find and strike the right balance with the academic community to say that we need to be much more flexible and we need to be much more accessible on a real-time basis as technologies are changing.
I want to come back and explore this more, but you hit on a really interesting point, which you just went over, which is you said, listen, the reason we're focused on reskilling is because we really value the knowledge people have of AT&T and the culture. And I want to come, Diane, to this culture point, because I think as much as there's a lot of talk about the role of learning and helping employees succeed, I think equally important is the role that culture plays in helping employees succeed. And I know that's something that you've spent a lot of time thinking about. So perhaps you could share some thoughts.
All right, so great, thank you. So I do have a lot of passion relative to culture and the role that it plays in organizations and us being at our best. I think I'd like to highlight 3 areas of culture that I think are really critical. The first thing that I would say is when you think about culture, it really is a driver of business results. The second piece is you've got to be intentional, as I'm sure you are at AT&T. You've got to be intentional in terms of what you're creating. And then the third piece around culture is that it really is a game changer. It's a competitive differentiator. And if I can just make a few comments about each of those. When you think about the fact that culture drives business results, I think about the quote that we all know from the management expert, Peter Drucker, and he said, culture trumps strategy every day. Now, I do have to wonder if he was alive today if he'd have used that same verb, trumps. But anyway, that's another topic. So you think about his comment, and then there was a quote one time from the previous Saks CEO, and he said, it's the people, it's the leadership, it's the ideas that drive business results at the end of the day. So if you think about the importance of it, without culture, there would be no innovation, right, in Apple. Without culture, there would be no service excellence in companies like Zappos, my favorite, or Nordstrom's, or the Ritz-Carlton. Without culture, you would not have delivery excellence in Amazon. And without culture, there would be no free bags with the Southwest, right? Like, that really makes the point about how culture drives the business performance. And then, the second point is around being intentional. And if I can give you a couple of things to think about, is the first piece of that is, who are you? What are your values? And always start there. The second piece would be around, do each of you, when you think about direction for culture, or I should say, how many of you have a cultural aspiration statement? Do any of you? Can I see it? So we do have one, so that's a great thing, or 2. So you know what, that's awesome, because cultural aspiration statements allow you to be really clear what you're building. So for example, at McGraw-Hill, our aspirational statement is to unlock the potential of every employee so that they're at their best, professionally and personally. And we all know the future worker is very focused on being successful, happy in all aspects of their life. And I would just, to close on that, it truly is a differentiator. And I believe if we get the culture right, then your organization and your people are going to thrive. So thank you.
Thank you. I want to actually come back to the skill gap issue, because I think one of the critical questions is there are a number of different players here. Obviously, the private sector has a role to play, the educational system, but also government. And government has been trying to play a role through workforce development and other initiatives. But I'm just curious, Rick, if you have any reflections or thoughts on what is the role of government in particular and some of the other players?
Yeah, well, the role of the private sector is important because both the training that's done in companies and the training that's done by many of the companies that are reflected here, including Coursera, directly to consumers, are helping to provide low-cost solutions to upskilling. The universities, historically, the elite universities have not focused very much on the pathway from the educational program to the career, except in the professional schools. The undergraduate education is generalist liberal arts, and there's a lot of rethinking going on in state university systems and in the entire system below the sort of top elite universities that maybe more vocational relevance in this day and age is a more important thing to do. One of the things we've learned at Coursera, interestingly, is that what learners want and what they will pay for in terms of online education is career relevant, skill development, and not, they're happy to audit and watch the liberal arts courses, but they need the vocational education. And that is beginning to create some shifting of understanding within the university community that the universities have a role to play beyond age 18 to 22. They have a lifelong role to play to help people develop throughout their careers. And that's actually the reason I came to Coursera. I saw a new mission for the university as we know it. And I think, it's taking a while. As universities change very slowly. Now governments, most government workforce development programs, as you and I were talking earlier, are very inefficient in this country. There are great models elsewhere in the world. I mean, Singapore is perhaps the prime example of a country that is really good at efficiently training people. They for example, have a tax credit program that gives every citizen over age 25 a $500 tax credit toward vocational education, which they can use on online platforms like Coursera, or they can go to night classes at the technical universities or the national universities. So that is working extremely well, and there's a high degree of engagement in terms of just a decentralized incentive for people to acquire skills. They also run some very efficient training programs. They realized they had a skills gap in data science. They came to us 3 years ago, and just after we launched the Johns Hopkins data science specialization, and they said, we want to do this. We want to buy this in bulk. We're going to train 200 students at a time. We're going to mentor them directly. We're going to provide them bonuses for completing the work. And they train hundreds of data scientists, online that way. We could be doing a lot better in this country with more efficient workforce development, taking advantage of great low-cost solutions online.
I want to pick up on this Singapore example, which essentially empowers individuals. And I want to even, John, pick up on something you said, which is you still look to see in some cases whether people have degrees. And I want to bring those two together and sort of say, I wonder if we need to figure out ways to empower individuals more generally. And so, for example, what I'm thinking is, in a lot of cases, there probably is more human potential locked up inside individuals who don't have a credential to unlock it. And let me give you an example of what I mean. You might have someone who's a war veteran who's returned from Iraq, who's been involved in supply chain and operations, and their credentials are as good as anyone who's studied operations or supply chain at a public university.
Absolutely.
Yet they don't have a credential which enables them to unlock their human potential. And what I take away from the Singapore example to bring it back together is that's an example of giving to the individual the power to unlock their own potential and to seek a range of different skills and capabilities. So as we think about the future of work, I'm curious to ask any of you, and Marco, you represent a different kind of atomized workforce, which is sort of empowered. What do you think of this idea, or how can we empower individuals to succeed in a world where there's much more skill insecurity, right?
Yes, this is something we say play out a lot. In our world, particularly the home trades, there is a lot of licensing and credentialing involved in being an electrician or a plumber or a tradesperson of that type, but it's very coarse. And what is happening now is on platforms like ours and others, we're getting very, very fine-grained review data. Right? Data about a specific technician doing a very specific job for a specific customer. And with that, we believe that companies like us, platforms like us, are creating a better signal as to the quality of the professionals on our platform. Interestingly, this is also teaching us about the skills gap. Because we can see this demand coming in real time, and we can see, wow, at least on our platform and of all the pros that we've engaged with, there's no one who's good at this particular type of job, be it in a home trade or an event service. And now something we're thinking about is how do we bring that information back out into the market? How do we say, hey, at least on our platform right here, there's an opportunity. If, say, you're an electrician in Tulsa, there is a need for people with your skills and attracting them onto the platform. I think it's far from a solved platform problem, but I'm hopeful that with the much more granular data that these transactional platforms create, you can hope to sort of get past this sort of very coarse credentialing as a way of providing a signal of quality.
But I also think that you have to make sure, I agree with everything you said, and I think you need to just be completely transparent about what this learning is going to lead to. So you don't just generically go in and pick a degree and then go figure out what you're gonna do in the workforce once you get to that stage of your career. We need to be very transparent about these are the skills necessary, this is the curriculums that align with those skills, not necessarily a degree program, it could be single courses, it could be certifications that are out there. And once you then have achieved the learning in that specific area, then there has to be a reason and the real value for the employee to see that they actually get a new job. So as we've gone through this reskilling effort at AT&T, then it's been over a 5-year process. And one of the things that drove a significant amount of momentum was when we started tracking if you engaged in learning and if you became a certified reskiller, we call them skills pivoters, then what happens to your career after that? And over the last year and a half, as we've started tracking these reskillers, they're 2 times more likely to get a new job. They're 4 times more likely to get a promotion or a progression within our company. And now the learner is making a decision not to say, this is something that I'm required to do, or this is something that my manager is mandating that I do. They are wanting to engage and own their career differently than they ever have before because of the transparency that's been provided to them up front. They are now the decision maker on their career, and it's much less of who you know to advance and much more of what you know.
So sticking on this topic of credentials for a moment, we probably all in some way use them as a heuristic to judge other people's capabilities. And I'm sort of curious whether you think the credentials we've got today are outdated, and if so, what are the characteristics of more meaningful credentials? And maybe Rick, I'll ask you first, and then Diane.
Well, I don't know that what we have is outdated necessarily. We know what a master's degree means in most fields, but we also know that there are ways to get more micro credentials that certify competencies. And that's what's really developing today, is a much richer array of micro-credentials. There are, as Marco was saying, there have always been in the skilled trades in certain fields, standards, licensing, with a clear standard of what you need. There in lots of professions you have CPA, CFA, and all those sorts of things. What we're seeing now is just a much broader awareness of this, like most of in the IT space where there's all these job shortages. Many of the large companies that create the software development tools, for the cloud or for various kinds of systems, are giving certifications. Microsoft credentials have been around for a long time, and they're very widely used. So I think we're just going to see a much richer set of micro-credentials available, and employers are going to start to understand them. The credentials associated with MOOCs that companies like Coursera and Udacity and edX and others are issuing are also beginning to become currency in the job market. They certified to...
We see them showing up on all of the resumes of applicants we get.
We were 2 years ago, the last time LinkedIn counted up where the credentials on their platform were coming from, we were second only to Microsoft. Coursera was number 2. We'll never reach number 1 now because LinkedIn is now part of Microsoft. So I think they won't publish that survey anymore. But so I'm skeptical. But I actually think if you went and hand counted, you'd find we probably passed Microsoft on that platform. So there's a lot of a lot of that is happening. Even college applicants are signaling competencies. I learned that 15% of the undergraduate applicants at Yale this year cited Coursera credentials in their application.
Yeah, you know, what comes to mind for me when you think about certifications, credentials, is I'd say 2 things. You know, we know for the future that we're going to be looking at these short programs of study where there's mastery of skills and then personalized learning. So what comes to mind, which all of us are involved in, are examples like, particularly with vocational schools. I'll give you an example. McGraw-Hill has just, we're doing some work now with Australia and the vocational schools there, right? So you look at the plumbing, you know, we're creating instructional design for plumbers or electricians. And, you know, that's what I get excited about, which I know all of us do. And then another one, like on a bigger scale, that to your point, we've had a lot of great certifications in the past, or credentialing. Being with Cisco for 14 years, one of the greatest things I think we ever did was networking academies, right? And you put this in place and it created hundreds of thousands of jobs around the world. So for me, I get excited about, we've done great work, but you look at where we're going, and I think the challenge to this team is how can we be more bold in putting these things together?
Marco, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the way in which the workforce is sort of atomizing, the rise of independent workers, freelancers, consultants, and all of that. How fundamentally do you think that's changing the workforce? And do you think that we're actually going to fundamentally employ far fewer people, or is this going to actually make it possible to create, you know, a whole different sort of set of jobs?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I would actually characterize it less a question of whether we will employ more or fewer and how these folks will be employed. I think what you are seeing is the disruption of the firm itself. If you think about a plumbing company historically, they provided many things to their technicians: a source of business, a brand that certified the quality of the work, insurance, sort of standing behind the work, back office capabilities, all things that technician needed to go out and do the work. Now, at the end of the day, it's usually just 1 or 2 people doing the actual job, and the firm exists to support that. And what you're seeing is platforms like us start by solving the problem of finding new customers. There's new insurance platforms where you can more easily self-insure as one of these individuals. Ever more software-based back office tools, be it scheduling, payments, and what have you, such that the individual is able to go out on their own. And I think there's a huge amount of efficiency that comes from this, not having to pay the 40%, 50% of the wage to the firm to support the overhead, but being able to capture it all yourself. But it comes with real risk, which is the stress of not having certainty in your work. And I think that's something that all of these platforms have to think very hard about how to solve, because I think when you ask these folks what they value most, security is at the top of the list. Autonomy and flexibility is very high and will come next, but if and only if they feel secure in their place of work, that they can provide enough for themselves and their family. So I have little doubt, I'm not an economist, so I'm more comfortable making sort of blanket statements. I'm very confident that the firm will continue to be disaggregated, and at least for these local services, we'll see an atomization of it. And I hope that we can create tools, both public and private, to provide as much security as possible in this new type of work. Now, it won't be the first time that people operate in this way. Hollywood very much already operates in this way. Journalism operates in this way to a significant degree. So we have examples of it working, but we're going to have to think about how to support it and make it successful.
You know, I think we'd be a little remiss to have a panel like this on the future of work without asking, how do we make sure that the future of work is one in which more Americans participate? And I guess related to that, you know, how do we address the issue of wage stagnation and some of the income inequality? So Rick and Diane, I'd love to just get some perspectives or thoughts on what could clearly be a whole conference in and of itself.
Yeah. Of course, the wages and income distribution don't have to be completely coupled, because we do have a tax system which could accomplish a significant amount of redistribution if that's what society wanted to do. So I'll leave that aside, but recognize that even if we are in a regime of constant or declining real wages for the majority of people, that doesn't mean that as long as there's an accumulation of wealth and overall growth in GDP, that you have the opportunity, at least, to have a rising standard of living across the income distribution. We've not accomplished that terribly well over the last 30 years, and we've had stagnating real incomes, both pre-tax and post-tax. There are some forces that I think should, over the next 20 years, put some upward pressure on real wages in this economy rather than downward pressure, and that is the aging of the population. Because there'll be more demand for middle skill and lower skill services as more people age and require the work of younger people to take care of them, and that in itself could put some pressure on wages that helps what otherwise will be a continued, I think, increase in the return to capital. I mean, the phenomenon that Thomas Piketty described, which is happening throughout the developed world, that the way technology has moved over the last 30 years has very much increased the return to capital, depressed return to labor. The aging population will help to offset that, but that underlying phenomenon is still going to be there.
Yeah, no, thanks, Rick. And, you know, we're all sitting here because we believe that education is the great equalizer, right? And when you ask about Americans participating and the wage inequality getting better, you know, there are three kind of things that come to mind for me. We're here, a lot of what we're trying to solve for education being more affordable, right? We're solving for education being more accessible, and we're solving for education and learning being more personalized to for the individual. And so for me, if we do those things, we are going to get there. And I think the other thing I'd say, you know, a lot of passion around the personalized learning. One of the reasons I have moved into education and learning now from being in high tech forever is my son, non-traditional learner, and with all the resources and support, it was still a very arduous journey, right? And so what I believe is if we solve for those things that we're talking about, which we will when you think about the talent that we have on this, I think the future is going to be a really strong one, and we'll get there.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to comment on one thing there, which is you laid out essentially the assumption about how important education is, which I think all of us would probably subscribe to. And I'm going to offer one slightly provocative thought here, which is if you take the sum total of how much we spend on education, it is a massively inefficient enterprise. And I'm going to say that by just highlighting a couple things. There aren't many different industries where, for example, for each 100 people you take in to sell your product to, maybe 20 or 30 will come out with the product you want. So I'm just saying, if we take 3-year completion rates for community college, 6-year completion rates, and I could go to every different part of the education economy and tell you a similar story. And so there is a real dialogue about whether we ought to invest more in education. I'm going to posit the opposite, which is there's more than enough money being spent. It's just really terribly spent. But that, I'm not actually going to let you respond to that, Rick. You might use this question as an opportunity to respond. But I think we're running out of time here, and I wanted to ask each of you for your final thoughts. And in particular, if there's one call to action that you want people in this room to walk away with as it relates to the future of work, what would it be? Marco, would you like to start?
So, I think by nature of being in this room and certainly being on this panel, we come from a very privileged position. And so I think the one thing I would encourage people to think about is take a broad view of the future of work. Yeah. It is not simply about, the 30% of the population that goes to college. It's about all of us and making an inclusive future of work that can support a middle class income and lifestyle for the broadest possible number of people. That doesn't make the challenge any easier. In fact, it makes it much harder, but only if we solve it sort of broadly have we truly achieved success.
Yeah, great, thanks. And I would say, if we want to attract and keep and develop great talent, then be intentional, get the culture right, so people really can thrive and your company will thrive. And I think the companies, the organizations of the future will think much more broadly than just the careers. They're going to think about the whole person and how can you help someone personally and professionally thrive.
I think that we all need to be very cognizant of linking very specific goals about the curriculums and the outcomes that we're looking at in partnership with businesses so that the future of work can be not so arduous on the actual individual, but that there can be good strategic plans that people can engage in that are affordable, that are accessible, that are very relevant to exactly how they want to navigate their careers in the future. And also understand that learning is not a one-time event. Learning will be lifelong for the future worker. And it could be in many different industries and many different careers for one individual as a result of making all of this effective, relevant learning very affordable and very accessible.
I would subscribe to all of that, and I guess my takeaway thought would be worry less about what the future of automation will bring 20, 30 years from now, and recognize that today there is a large skill gap in many technical fields, and that both very high income levels like data scientists and much more moderate income levels like just computer technicians and cybersecurity specialists. And there are opportunities to efficiently use the educational system to address those needs at very low cost. I'll just take your bait because the only thing less efficient, the thing that's less efficient, well, there are many things less efficient than education. Government would be one, but healthcare would be particularly notable. And because healthcare, look at it this way, we spend twice or three times as much per capita as most advanced countries.
Say Australia.
With exactly the same outcome. Everybody dies.
Just because we attempted to start
Sounds like you've had that discussion before.
Just because we attempted to start this on a note of optimism, I'm going to end with a note of optimism, which is my takeaway in thinking about this whole area and thinking about the workforce is just how boundless human potential is.
That's right.
And just how much human potential has not yet been unlocked because we haven't been able to name it or credential it or recognize it. And also just how many people are capable of all different kinds of learning. And in many cases, we come into it with many of the unconscious biases about what people are and aren't capable of. And if we could release more of that, I think we'll find more good things will be unleashed in our learning economy. And with that, thank you everyone for joining us for this panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you to the panelists for joining us. That was terrific.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
That was great.
Ladies and gentlemen, please enjoy the special preview of a video created in honor of Marion Wright Edelman. We are delighted to recognize this remarkable woman and champion for change as our 2017 Lifetime Achievement Award winner at tomorrow's closing dinner, where she will share her remarks. Our closing dinner keynote fireside chat will also feature the amazing author of The Big Short and Moneyball, Michael Lewis.
year is 1960. Marion Wright Edelman was a student at Spelman College, an outstanding student.
It was during the height of the Civil Rights Movement. She was one of these leaders who spoke up and spoke out against segregation and racial discrimination. She worked with Martin Luther King Jr. like we all did.
We were meeting somewhere every day, either at a lunch counter or in jail. And the first day of our jail experience, March 15, 1960, Marion was a part of that experience.
It was very dangerous. People had been beaten, arrested, jailed, but she went in places that others dared to go.
In the late 1960s, we used to go to Washington for the famous peace marches. We were all in awe of Marion.
I met Marion in 1967. I was working for Senator Robert Kennedy. We went to Mississippi because there was a big fight going on about the future of the Head Start program.
Marion Edelman had been an attorney at that time with the Legal Defense Fund and had taken Senator Kennedy and others on a tour to see hunger in real life and translated that into a national problem and received national attention. That really sparked the origin and the development of the Children's Defense Fund as a follow-up to the Civil Rights era and a focus on children specifically.
She founded the Children's Defense Fund. It became her baby.
Education is a critical part of our mission because we really see it as a continuation of children's civil rights. And if in fact children are going to thrive in school and thrive in the education realm, we've got to ensure that they're healthy.
You can't learn if you haven't eaten breakfast or lunch. You can't learn if you live in an abusive situation. You can't learn if you don't have good health care. So Marion thinks about the totality of all the social elements that have to be in place for young people to learn, but also to have all the opportunities that every other child has.
Marion grew up in a small town in South Carolina, totally segregated. That is what drove her. Her parents were absolutely determined that all 5 of the children in the family would go to college, and of course that was the bridge out.
Mrs. Edelman has taught us that education is a gateway for children. If you know better, if you learn better, if you have opportunity, then you have a fighting chance in this nation.
The work that she does now with the Freedom Schools, which is a major effort in over 100 locations in the United States, I think is her passion at the moment.
I speak to college students who participate during the summer in the Freedom School program. These are young people that are part of the Children's Defense Fund to help educate, to help organize for the children in America.
Over the past 4 decades, Mrs. Edelman and the Children's Defense Fund's legislative impact on education has been tremendous.
Well over 80 or 90 different pieces of legislation have been put together over these past 4 decades, which really focus on all of the needs of children and families.
She has the capacity of inviting, persuading, and involving other people all the way from the local community to the halls of Congress.
She has taken solid and strong position with members of Congress, both Democrats and Republicans. She's so determined to leave this little piece of real estate we call America a little better than we found it.
If you have a conscience, you cannot help but be touched by the kind of commitment she has made and the kind of commitment she calls us to be engaged in, to see every child as our child.
She takes you in and teaches you, but it's really the fire that she brings to everyone she meets that is infectious.
She's been that persistent moral voice and keeps us on track in terms of recognizing that we can't give up.
There's a cadre of people all over America, in every corner of our country, that follow her leadership, her vision.
The legacy of Marian Wright Edelman, I think, will be on that short dash between two dates, birth date and date of transition. She made a difference. Congratulations, Marian, and thank you for your commitment.
If there's anyone in America that should be honored the way she's been honored, it is her.
Marian deserves the Lifetime Achievement Award because she's never quit. Best wishes and much love.
Congratulations, Mrs. Edelman, for this award.
Thank you for all you do for children.
Congratulations, Marian. I am so proud of you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Paul Reville.
Good afternoon. I can't think of anybody whose life work better represents the kind of subjects that we're going to be talking about in this next panel than Marian Wright Edelman, so that it's, however coincidental that we wind up coming just after that presentation, it ideally sets the tone for what we're going to be talking about. My name is Paul Reville. I am the executive and founding director of the Harvard Graduate School of Education's Education Redesign Lab, and I'm a professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and I'm delighted to be with you today. You are about to meet four extraordinary leaders. I don't think of them as bosses in the Tammany Hall sense of bosses as the title read for this session, but rather leaders, extraordinary mayors. We have 3 current mayors and 1 former mayor who is going to be commenting on the work of this initiative that we'll be describing today. These are leaders who have stepped out and said, doing what we need to do for the prosperity and long-term health of our communities goes beyond simply providing an adequate school system, but extends to making sure that each and every one of our children is successful. And so they have committed themselves to redefining the social compact with citizens, with children, and with their families, and building out systems of opportunity and support in an initiative that our Education Redesign Lab heads call By All Means. So it's a great privilege for me to welcome to the stage now Mayor Libby Schaaf of Oakland, California, Mayor Jorge Elorza of Providence, Rhode Island, Mayor, I think they're coming, so they're going to all appear at once, Mayor Kim Driscoll of Salem, Massachusetts, and former Washington, D.C. mayor and a long-term education reform leader and veteran, Adrian Fenty, who is now a partner in Macro Ventures and spans both worlds of this conference. I welcome our panelists to the stage. Okay, we're going to start quickly. My job is to just give a brief framing for the By All Means initiative, and then each of our mayors, our 3 mayors, are going to talk to you about what they've been doing in their respective cities, and then we're going to turn to Adrian and ask him to talk a little bit about his reflections, given his experience both as a mayor and having been heavily involved in education, and now in the world of Macro Ventures, where he works. The theme here starts in Massachusetts. I'm from Massachusetts. I used to be the Secretary of Education in Massachusetts. And Massachusetts, as you probably know, is the birthplace of public education. One of our most prominent education leaders was Horace Mann. Horace Mann had the proposition that education, above all things, would be the great balance wheel of society. That education would be the great equalizer, that if we had a common school that welcomed everyone, irrespective of gender or race or creed or income, and welcomed everyone into a school, gave them all a quality common school treatment, that in the end they'd go out and we'd have a meritocracy where effort and talent would rise to the top. That was a radical and important proposition in the mid-19th century. Today, to believe that that proposition is going to work in terms of equalizing opportunity and success in our society, I would submit to you, as an exercise in magical thinking. So when I left my role in government in Massachusetts, we were the leading state in the country. We had all kinds of education statistics based on averages that would show you that we were #1 in the country, #1 in the world on a number of different kinds of indicators. But yet we still had deep, persistent achievement gaps. In spite of an incredible investment in education reform, lots of money, lots of hard work, lots of progress, but we still had an iron law correlation between socioeconomic status and educational achievement and attainment. So it seemed like an opportune time to step back and think a little bit about where we need to go in the 21st century beyond simply tinkering with the system that we'd inherited from the 19th century. So we set about doing that by opening a conversation about poverty, not in a deficit model kind of way, not in a stereotyping way, but to say this iron law correlation between socioeconomic status and educational achievement and attainment undeniably exists. The system as we currently know it, schooling as we currently know it, is clearly too weak an intervention to overcome poverty on average. Doesn't predict anything for any individual, but on average, your demographics are a pretty good predictor of your educational attainment and achievement. So if we were going to design a system that was really about educating all children to a high level, giving all children an opportunity to be successful, what would that design look like? And we posited 3 principles for the design of that. We said it ought to be personalized. It ought to meet every child where he or she is in early childhood and give them what they need inside and outside of school in order to be successful. Secondly, it ought to attack those impediments, those obstacles in the lives of children that get in the way of them coming to school in the first place and being present and open and ready to learn when they got there. Thirdly, we needed to level the playing field with respect to out-of-school learning opportunities. Children in the K-12 system as currently constructed, conventional public schools, spend less than 20% of their waking hours in school. The other 80% is outside of school. Affluent parents provide virtually continuous round-the-clock enhancements to their education. Other children have next to nothing. So if we want to get to all means all, we're going to have to level that playing field. So we built an organization to help start a national conversation about this topic, to craft a new, much broader, much bolder vision about what education ought to be about. And that's the Education Redesign Lab. We work through advocacy, research, field work, and field building. In that field work that we do, we created an initiative where we scoured the country and looked for 6 leaders in mayors, because we saw this as a job that was too big for schools alone. Schools alone cannot get us to all means all. It would take whole communities. So we looked for 6 mayors who looked beyond simply providing an adequate education, and we found 6 mayors, 3 of whom are joining us on the stage today to participate in an initiative called By All Means, where they convene children's cabinets and work on some of those principles and those issues that I discussed. The 6 cities are represented here: Oakland, California; Louisville, Kentucky; Providence, Rhode Island; and 3 cities in Massachusetts: Salem, represented in our group today; Somerville, and the city of Newton. And together, these mayors, their children's cabinets, our colleagues at Harvard and around the country, a number of partners, are working together, committing leadership, committing resources, developing plans, putting together indicators of progress, increasing access that children have to various services and supports, building out systems of support and opportunity to make it possible for all of our children to be successful in school. So that's what the work is all about. I realize this is a technological audience, so one of the challenges I give you in listening to our presenters today is to listen to this in terms of what you think are the technological applications that would apply to helping these mayors and their colleagues in the cities address the challenges they describe and be part of the solution that is going to render an equal platform on which all of our children can achieve at high levels. So with that, we're going to turn it over to each of our 3 participating mayors to describe what they've been up to, and then we'll have some conversation about it. Libby, you're first up.
Great. Thanks. In Oakland, California, we want to disrupt poverty. We lie on the edge of Silicon Valley, amazing job opportunities, some of the best educational institutions of higher learning, Stanford, UC Berkeley. And yet, of my 9th grade class, only 10% of them will have a college degree by the time they are 23 years old. What a waste of human potential. And so our main initiative that is part of the By All Means program is the Oakland Promise. And this is not your daddy's promise program, okay? This is a lot bigger and more comprehensive. It is literally a cradle to career initiative that we know in 10 years will triple the number of Oakland public school students, whether they graduate from a district or charter-run public school, that will actually have a college degree and be prepared for career success. We start with babies born into poverty, and give them a $500 college savings account, as well as financial coaching for the parents and immediate financial assistance. Then in kindergarten, we give every child, regardless of income, a $100 scholarship. We also work with teachers, parents, community, and principals to build a college-going culture. I heard our last panel talk a lot about the importance of culture. That is true for schools as well. We also use, we're going to talk about technology a little bit, behavioral nudges. These scholarship awards are tied with behavioral nudges that remind families and students what they need to be college ready at that moment in time. We deposit into this scholarship over time during different academic milestones, and by the time the students graduate, they have $4,000 for college. In middle schools and high schools, and this is the initiative that we're really focused on with Harvard, we have future centers. And these are actual resource centers, professionally staffed, that are college and career access hubs, where we bridge the information gap, where we provide families access to technology, and we really educate students about what it takes to get into college as well as to pay for college. And what are the career opportunities and what type of education does it take to become eligible for those career opportunities. And then finally, we provide multi-year college scholarships, but more importantly, persistent support. We know that of our low-income students that go to college, only 20% are finishing. That's a national statistic. We provide our students with a one-on-one mentor, peer support groups, counseling, and regular retreats so that we give them the social and emotional support, not just to get into college, but to finish college. That's the overview of the Oakland Promise. It is supported by our Children's Cabinet. We have an actual formal joint powers authority, as well as something that we call the Oakland Thrives Leadership Council. And I will say that having a big, bold initiative like the Promise is something that has really galvanized and created partnerships where we never imagined them to be. With our local healthcare providers, with our county government, with our school system, it really has been an amazing experience of how an entire community can rally around a vision where we are not going to leave any child behind.
Thank you, Libby. Appreciate that. Okay, Jorge, it's to you.
Thank you, Paul. Good afternoon, everyone. So in Providence, we've used the By All Means initiative to launch our own All-In Education Summit and All-In Education Initiative. And what that means to us is, as well, a full cradle-to-career initiative where we think very purposefully about the kinds of interventions and resources that our young people and families have throughout their entire educational career, and then even afterwards, because we feel that our responsibility to them extends even after high school graduation. And so the By All Means initiative has provided an organizing framework around the work that we're doing to complement some of the existing work that we have. So for example, for the cradle part of the initiative, we have the Providence Talks program, and the Providence Talks program is the only program of its kind at scale in the country that's working very focused, in a very focused way on addressing the 30 million word gap. And this is all based on the principle that a parent is a child's first and most important teacher. And how do we build up that agency and that sense of, agency so that parents can take ownership over their child's education? So we want to make sure that our children are ready for kindergarten by the time they begin. And there are a number of initiatives that we have where we're investing in our children, the whole child, inside of the classroom and very importantly outside of the classroom as well. But what we've also come to realize is that while there's a lot that we can do as a school department and as a city, there's only so much that we can do. And if all truly does mean all, and we want to reach every single child, then we need our partners and we need our stakeholders in the community. And so about a month and a half ago, we had a huge community gathering, a community summit. We had about 500 people who gave up their entire Saturday to spend the day talking about education and helping us think of ways of how they can be more engaged and how we can provide these new avenues of engagement for the community in the schools. And it comes at a very interesting time for us in our city, but I think also within the national context, that you have a number of people that just want to help. They want to contribute, they want to volunteer, they don't know exactly how to get involved. And we want to take advantage of this while at the same time making sure that our students have the resources, the attention, and the supports that they need so that they can achieve their potential.
Thank you, Jorge. Kim, tell us about Salem.
Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation and for all the work that we're doing collectively. It's great to hear Libby and Jorge's work so far. Salem, pretty diverse community, 14 miles north of Boston, teach in 33 different languages, have really struggled with our public school setting around challenges of closing the achievement gap. Kids like mine, 2 parents, college educated, do quite well in our schools, but too few of our students are really achieving the type of success we know they're capable of. With our By All Means initiative, we're really looking to marry the wonderful array of community assets that we have within our school district. We are fortunate that for a small city, and the cohorts that are part of this initiative are small and large, and it's amazing, regardless of the size, we all kind of suffer with some of the same challenges, just in different scales. In our community, we've got this rich array of resources, museums, a National Park Service site, a university, a world-class hospital. We punch out of our weight class for our size, but we hadn't figured out how to bridge those terrific organizations and bring them into our schools to help with the resource needs that we have there. By forming our version of a children's cabinet, we had key stakeholders, CEOs from all of these groups around the table, and really helped fostering an environment where education is a community mission. It's not just the school district's job or the city's job to educate our public students, it's our community's job. Working through those efforts, we were able to align some of the needs with these rich array of partners that we have. Having a world-class museum who wants to be helpful, but not being able to speak the same language about what's happening in the academic world in our community was holding us back. We had an opportunity to work with these partners, but this By All Means initiative made it a much more meaningful conversation that's focused on how do we braid together the services we need within our schools, because that's the touch point. Really hardworking teachers who know the 20 kids in their classroom or 25 kids in their classroom, know their needs, but don't necessarily know how to connect it to the resources that exist in our community. And lots of really talented, hardworking community partners who do things very well, but don't necessarily know how to navigate our school system. So through our By All Means initiative, we're working with a partnership called City Connects, born out of Boston Public Schools, that braids together resources within the classroom setting and connects those rich array of partners for social, emotional, developmental support. One of the best things that we're excited about, or one of the best, I would say, attributes of this program is it's not just for the needy kids. Sure, we have kids who have food insecurities, who need coats in winter, who suffer with not having the type of supportive parental environment at home. But we also have kids from very affluent parents who are on an autism spectrum, or have eating disorders, or have an array of needs that exist regardless of your income or their family's income. This program is designed to make sure we're helping every single student. It starts this September in a K-8 model where our teachers will serve with our adjustment counselors through our City Connects program to better understand each child. We just shouldn't know what every third grader's reading level is. We should have a better understanding of what their needs are. Whether they need recreational basketball, they're a great program, someone to help with their social inclusion, or a coat in winter. Having a program like City Connects allows our teachers and our outside partners really rich array of youth service organizations to museums, hospitals, and park service sites, bridging that gap and providing our students and our families a level of support that would be unparalleled to what they're used to now. If you're a teacher trying to help a student, you hope you know about that program. If you're a family in need, maybe you have access to that help. We're going to break down that barrier, make it easier for everybody to navigate without a stigma, without any attention to who you are or where you came from. And putting those things together, we hope is going to improve student outcomes. We know City Connects works. They're a proven model. They're in over 70 school districts throughout the country. We've seen increased test scores, opportunities for students to cut down on absenteeism, higher high school graduation rates. So we're really looking forward to measuring this. This is not just a wraparound service model that we hope will work well. We're really partnering in a way where we can track this data and put our students, all of our students, on a trajectory for success.
Thank you very much, Kim. Adrian, you've got both the muscles and the scars of a mayor who took education seriously and invested a lot of leadership in it. Some people think, well, you can't really change these systems of education. They're too hidebound and it's not possible. You've just heard from 3 mayors who are at work trying to do that. I'm curious about your reflections and what you think about what you've heard.
Well, first, I want to thank you and the team at Harvard for putting this together. And not just for putting a program together, but inviting mayors to be at the head of it. And I'll tell you why, because education is a tough one for mayors. Mayors are kind of impatient and used to getting things done. And neither one of those two things is commonplace in most urban school systems. And so the perspective of a mayor, and I remember it 10 years ago when we were, 10 years ago to the month when I was about to take over the DC school system, here's the thought, the mayor, a parent comes up to you, and just like Mayor Schaaf says, it's 23% of the kids in Oakland are going on to college and to graduate. Well, the same type of statistics exist with reading grade levels, math grade levels, dropout rates, graduation rates. And so you envision yourself as this parent and you're like, well, what is my answer to this person? How can I literally be in charge of a city that has these types of problems? But in every urban sector in this entire country, the United States of America, that is exactly what exists right now. Mm-hmm. Those are the statistics everywhere, San Francisco, LA, New York, Chicago. And so the question is, when you sit in a mayor's chair is, well, when is it going to change? Because we should have 100% of our kids going on to college, because if you're a parent, if you have 3 kids, you would certainly think that all 3 of them are going to go to college, so why would you have a different set of standards for the kids and parents in your system? And so mayors come with a certain amount of impatience that I think is going to reach some great results. So I remember when we approached Michael Bloomberg, who had just taken over the New York City system, about what to do, and he explained it as you can't have like 9 people in charge, and what he meant was you can't have a school board in charge, you need to have the mayor in charge of the school system. And again, what I always told people was Bloomberg and Richard Daley before him in Chicago, they already had enough power. They weren't looking for more power. What they were looking for was accountability. And here's the issue. So you are exploring some tremendous issues about wraparound services. And I'll just close with what Michelle Rhee used to tell people. And she said, in the very first cabinet meeting I had, when we had taken over the school system, I literally appointed her as the chancellor of the DC school system June 12, 2007, so it's almost 10 years to the day. So I told everyone in the cabinet, human resources, health, child welfare, prison system, you name it, police department, fire department, I said, listen, whatever she says, she gets. I said it exactly like that, and I didn't hesitate. Because I was a city council member before, I was tired of people from the school system walking around complaining, that they didn't have the resources of the government. So I think what you guys are going to put together is a framework of what we looked at and what Bloomberg and what Daley looked at is, yes, you have to have these wraparound services in order to fix all the problems in a city and achieve the results that the parents want. but there has to be some accountability also.
Right.
And that's why, as I said in the beginning, I'm glad that because you could have had anybody from the city, president of the school board,
That's right.
whomever, come and be part of this. I'm really glad that you got mayors involved. I think it's going to yield some great results.
Well, thank you. It did seem to us that it was a much bigger job than we had any right to put on superintendents by themselves, because we were asking for sort of lifelong outcomes with a relatively weak intervention. But I wonder, just one follow-up with, with you on this, Adrian. So much of this is about, I mean, embedded in the work that you heard the three mayors talk about is a reconceptualization of what the community needs to do for its children that goes beyond just 6 hours a day, 180 days a year, cradle to career, that kind of language. Do you think the public will exists for that? And if not, what are the ways in which you could generate public will for a conception of education that's broader and deeper and much more likely to be effective than the relatively simplistic idea that we currently have?
Yeah, well, just like any broken organization, in order to take it from quote unquote broken and to being what you expect out of it, some very difficult decisions are going to have to be made. So I'd say the public will exist. Like if you walk around and tell people the school system is broken and needs to change, 100% of the people are going to agree with you, 100%. The problem is when you start making the 3 or 4 toughest changes that need to be made, and then the special interests come out of the woodwork, then that's when you really need people to have some fortitude. And not just the elected officials, because they obviously have it, but the people in the community, because it gets very hairy and confusing, and it's drawn upon all kind of geographic and even racial lines, to be honest with you.
Right.
So I think that's where the community needs to have fortitude. So I say, yes, they want to have change, 100%. Does the community have the fortitude or the stomach, do you know what I mean, to deal with it when it happens?
That's
I think we've got to work on that. We've got to work on our mental, on our stomach.
And the case that we make for this kind of work.
Was that?
And the case that we make for this kind of work.
Yeah, there are probably, there's probably a brilliant way to put it before the people, but it hasn't been discovered yet. And for now, people it comes out a little bit controversial.
Yeah. Let me, this is a technology conference, a lot of technology leaders here. Some are developing products just simply to, quite frankly, navigate around the system. Others developing products that could easily be embedded in the system and could be of service in broadening the scope of what the system does. So I'm wondering among our mayors how you react to some of the things that you've heard here, how you think technology could be harnessed in service of meeting the challenges that you describe in your respective communities.
Do you want me to start?
Yeah, go ahead, Libby.
Sure, the Californian. So, I mentioned this before, that the issue of behavioral nudges, we don't want to just have a scholarship fund sitting out there. We want to use it as a communication tool, but we need technology to enable that communication, that behavioral nudge, to remind families what they should be doing to make their child college ready. We also are going to need to really use data. If we want to make sure that a child is on track from day one for success, we're going to have to be monitoring who's doing what along the way. That's a huge unmet potential. Finally, if we're sending hundreds of mentors off to mentor both pre and during college students, that would not happen without technology, especially the way young people communicate today. And then finally, in our future centers, we're finding that technology access is a big need. So not only do we have computers and technology there, but we're also linking families up with home resources. They're getting high-speed internet connections through special deals that we have. They're getting access to home computers. That's huge. But my favorite role that technology can play is recognizing that you don't have a skilled workforce that is ready to fill all the jobs that you have. And so we've been very pleased to have people like Mark Benioff in Salesforce as our very first investors in this vision, because he realizes that his company will not succeed if he isn't nurturing his future workforce, which is coming out of our schools, and recognizing also that tech lacks diversity. Let's just be honest about that. And I have a very diverse student body in Oakland that is hungry for these opportunities, and a lot of tech leaders recognize that there's a great potential there.
I'm glad you made the argument, of the economic argument, because to me, I think that's at the base partly of the case that needs to be made for this, that though most of us come to events like this and professions like ours out of a moral conviction that this is just the right thing to do for children, and we're committed to that sense of equity in society, even if you don't come from that place, it's hard to envision a future for our democracy and our society where we have a student population nationally that's more than half low-income youngsters, more than half students of color, groups with which we've historically not been very successful. They're the new majority. If we don't educate them, it's virtually impossible to grow the economy, and we'll simultaneously be growing an underclass that becomes more and more expensive for the rest of us to carry. So it's an imperative, and we got to get after it. Jorge, what do you think on the technological implications?
You know, as much as Mayor Fenty mentioned, as much as we hear from others, don't touch education. Education is a third rail, and even if you're wildly successful, you're not going to see the benefits until 10, 15 years, long after you're out of office. And so nonetheless, we're here, and we've made education our issue. And we recognize that if all truly does mean all, we need to tap into all of the technologies that exist to help us reach every individual. So there are a few things that come to mind in terms of the power of technology. We talk a great deal about how to personalize learning. And I think that as mayors go, I think we're all there. And at the superintendent level and beyond, we all recognize that individualized, personalized learning is the future. And we're all waiting for that micro-credentialing, that badging technology to take hold. And so, I really do think that once that comes, we can move to true mastery-based learning and maybe start to disrupt or completely deconstruct this K through 12 grade model. So that's exciting. We all believe that's the way of the future. We're just waiting for the technology to enable it. Second thing that comes to mind is we also recognize that it's not just about the context, the content. It's also about social and emotional learning. And I've heard of many creative ways to measure a child's development along social and emotional learning scales. And so I'm certainly waiting to see that be even more fully developed. And that's ready to be incorporated. We're ready to go on that. The last piece is, oftentimes the way that, the folks who are at the table making education policy decisions are folks like us, who I assume most of us did fairly well in the formal education system. And we leave out the voices of those folks who didn't do so well. And in a number of convenings that we've brought together recently, it's so interesting how you hear people report out on the issues that they most care about, but then you have either students or parents, and the issues that they bring up are completely different, and we would have never caught it had they not been at the table. And so what I would love to see is this technology that enables even further, deeper, and more genuine engagement from the surrounding community, so that it informs the policies that we're adopting. I know that technology can do this, and I know it can unlock a great deal of potential that we have, but we're all sort of still sitting on edge and seeing what that technology will be.
You made a point, and I do think we're kind of in the middle of a conversation nationally about education reform now. And since there's a lot of pushback on testing and on standards and on different kinds of schools and choice and all the rest of it, there's an opportunity to put goals that have to do with social and emotional development, that have to do with children's well-being, into the equation here, the accountability equation that Adrian mentioned earlier. And that's part and parcel of what you're saying, is we need to be more broadly accountable for the health and well-being and prosperity of our children. And I don't know that we're ready to take advantage of that moment in the policy discussion that's open right now, but technology could certainly be a tool in helping that. Kim, what about your take on
Yeah,
technology?
2 quick thoughts, and just to pick up, I think if you think about what we're all trying to do, we're trying to bring a little bit of Finland to our communities when it comes to how we think about our educational system. And as a smaller district, I would say to you that our biggest challenge is still poverty. Access to technology still has to do more with poverty than our ability to provide a Chromebook or an iPad for everybody within our school district. The second piece of that, I would say, is having a workforce that primarily is over the age of 35, that doesn't move as quickly when you think about your entire teaching profession, hugely overworked, lots of pressure. I mean, we're in turnaround mode. We are talking about education all the time in our community. We are chasing what's the best way for us to make sure our kids aren't left behind. And having an educated workforce of teachers and administrators who understand these technology platforms and can wade their way through what are the best ones that work for us, the right time at the right place, that also we have the resources to fund. I think that's really, really tricky. That's putting a lot on people who are already super overtaxed in terms of their time, and more opportunities for us to have those individuals understanding how technology can support their work is critical. I think there's just a big divide from the teacher in front of the classroom who's terrific, hardworking, accountable, cares about kids, knowing the things that all the folks in this room are working on, and how that could not only inform their practice, but help them learn and feel comfortable with that technology. And if we don't figure that piece out, the pace is just going to continue to outrun our ability to keep up with it.
Adrian, I want to ask you a financial question, but again, sort of embedded in the concept here is the idea that what we need to do for all children is what middle class, upper middle class families routinely do for their own in terms of providing systems of support and opportunity that wrap around them from prenatal time all the way till, as far as I can see, they're in their 20s and 30s. So the first question that invariably comes up when we introduce this topic is, well, doesn't that automatically mean lots more money? And some people will say, well, it means better spending existing money, but other people will say, well, we've got to face up to the fact that if you need more support, if you need more opportunities, some kids get it naturally at home, others don't, we're going to have to spend more. I wonder how you come down on that and what you think the political implications of that are.
Yeah, so 2 anecdotes, right? So education advocates fall into the same trap that most advocates before government fall into. It's the strangest thing. Like, people would always come to me and say, are you going to increase funding for, say, the Department of Parks and Recreation? It's such an anti-private sector thing. Like, you would never ask somebody in the private sector, are you going to spend more on something? You'd always ask them, are you going to get more results? Are you going to be more productive? Mm-hmm. And but if you look at any government in the country, state, local, or federal, that's how we judge. It's like, oh, yes, they must be doing a better job because they're spending more money on it. It's the craziest thing. And I can't remember the gentleman's name, but he ran Chicago school system after Arnie Duncan. Someone here knows his name. Ron, but I was on a panel with him. I think it was at this panel 4 years ago, and he said, you know what? I would trade probably a couple $100 million of my budget in order to have more autonomy. Because what he found was that, and this is to your point, if you're a middle class, upper class family spends way more than 9 to 3 with their kid. They go 9 to 3, and then they're probably going till 8 o'clock, and they're probably doing something in the morning. But try to extend the school day. Mm-hmm. You know, if you're in charge of a school system or you're one of these 3 mayors, there's so many rules, union and otherwise, that prevent you from doing so. And so what happens is the lower income kids, after they go home, if their parents are working all night, they don't have that same and you could do it in a school system. So I do want to say something about the technology, and I speak as someone who was in DC and now and work in Silicon Valley. I used to think that technology was the big word in Silicon Valley, but there's 3 other big words. One of them is innovation. It's just innovation by any means. You're trying something new. The second is disruption. You know what I mean? An old legacy system needs to be disrupted. Right? I mean, you see it in everything in Silicon Valley. It's why Netflix and LinkedIn and everything exists. But the third one that I never really appreciated until I started working out there is failure. Failure is a common theme in Silicon Valley as you'll ever find. And the reason is, if you're not willing to fail, if you're really not willing to try something new, then you're not ever really going to make any dramatic change. And that's why, I appreciate, that you're founded and in charge of the Education Redesign Lab, because I think it's got to be redesigned, right? I mean, the school building, as Davis pointed out in Waiting for Superman, looks exactly like it did 100 years ago. Nothing has changed.
That's right.
Nothing. I mean, that's ridiculous. So we got to be willing to fail and innovate and disrupt.
Right. I want to ask a question about governance with respect to this. And so we're in an era of changing governance. We had the ESSA federal legislation passed. We have a new administration in Washington. A lot more responsibility being pushed back to the states. This is a municipal initiative that we're describing. I wonder what each of you would say with respect to colleagues at the state level or those at the federal government level relative to what kind of help and support you would need for them as you do what we described earlier, fundamentally kind of redefining the social compact at a local level, but still needing to be interconnected at those other two levels.
Yeah. So I would say for us, having state and federal officials who are more of a partner and less of an auditor so that we can move forward with innovation, with allowing failure. I would say having a healthy ecosystem means we can't have kids fearful about immigration status and not having family members here, lots of blended family in our community. And I would say incentives work better than sticks, so creating incentives for us to have best practices, change those poor practices, put kids first is a lot better than a regulation or a crack over the head if you don't.
Okay, thanks.
So the first thing that comes to mind is the race to the top model. So there's a prize, and we're all competing for it. We, in Rhode Island, at the state level, we were successful several years ago, and we were able to get the resources. But even had we not received the federal resources, there are a number of reforms that enabled at the state level. And so, I would certainly encourage those kinds of nudges and that prize aspect. In terms of the federal government, what I would certainly ask for is more flexibility. We are laboratories of experimentation. Some things will work, some things won't work. But let us experiment. Let us try new things. And I would also, perhaps this isn't a policy change, but perhaps a change in terms of mentality. In terms of a Department of Education, I would think of it more of as a Department of School Supports or Department of Student Supports. And I think that'll go a long way to helping us be partners so that we can work together.
I think people are recognizing that cities are where the innovation is at. I like to say that as mayors, we really don't have time or patience for the partisan gridlock that is going on at other layers of government. We all belong to the party of get shit done, right? Agreed? So, support us. Support us in trying things out. If you could transform educational outcomes for every child in the city of Oakland, that is revolutionary. If you support me in proving that, I promise you that we will change the way that we spend the public dollar, because the return on investment is massive. And so I know that, I will not get too political, but in Oakland, California, people are not very excited about the changes in the national government. And this idea that they can make this tangible change where they live with their children is really inspirational. And so to support these initiatives that have a lot of local energy around them and recognize that they really are the blueprints, they really are the pilots for monumental change that will happen everywhere.
Well, and I do think at some level it's consistent with a new kind of federalism to say to us in our local communities, it's up to us now to rewrite this social compact and to redefine what we as communities want to do for our children. And what we want to do for our children is not only in the children's interest, but in our community's interest, and the way in which we preserve and develop an economy as a democracy. Any closing words of advice, Adrian, for your colleagues here who are still in the trenches?
Yes, I would just, not for them, but I would say to the communities out there, like sometimes school boards are part of the problem, and that's why I did away with mine. So I would say, one, make sure your school board hires somebody great, And then 2, make sure your school board doesn't micromanage that person, because everyone cares about education, but no other agency is run by a group of people. The police department, fire department, all run by people who know what they're doing, and you allow them to do their job.
Good closing thought. Well, I want to thank you, Adrian, for joining us and bringing your expertise to the conversation. I want to thank our 3 mayors for your outstanding leadership and willingness to be here and share with the audience. Thank all of you for your continuing interest. I can think of no more important work in America than what we've just described. Thanks very much for being here.